By the time I reached apartment 4B that morning, I already knew something was wrong. The hallway was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel heavy, and from behind my neighbor's door came the soft, broken sound of someone trying very hard not to cry. I had only knocked once when the door opened just enough for me to see Maribel Cross standing there with red eyes, trembling hands, and a face that looked like it had been holding back an entire storm. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she looked at me like I was the last safe thing left in the world and whispered, "I was hoping it would be you. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the kind of help that arrives right when someone is about to give up, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Ancient Truth." Sometimes one small act of compassion can change a life forever, and this story begins with a knock on a door that neither of us would ever forget. My name is Callum Reeve, and at 36, I had become very good at living quietly. I worked as a building maintenance supervisor for a set of old brick apartments near a peaceful city park, where the mornings were usually filled with sunlight, birds on window ledges, and the sound of people leaving for work with coffee in hand. I knew the pipes that rattled on cold days, the elevator that complained between the third and fourth floors, and which tenants preferred email over phone calls. What I did not know, or at least what I had convinced myself not to know, was how lonely a person could be while surrounded by walls full of people. Maribel had moved into 4B nearly 8 months earlier. She was not the kind of person who demanded attention. She kept her hair tied loosely at the back of her neck, wore soft-colored cardigans even in warm weather, and always carried reusable grocery bags folded perfectly under one arm. She taught art at a community center, I had learned from a package label once, and sometimes I would see her carrying rolls of paper, small canvases, or boxes of crayons up the stairs when the elevator was out. She always smiled politely, but there was something guarded behind it, as if she had learned to make herself gentle enough that no one would ask questions. I had noticed her, of course. It was hard not to. Not because she was loud or dramatic, but because she seemed to move through the world with a sadness she kept carefully folded inside her. On sunny mornings, she watered the little basil plant outside her door. On rainy afternoons, she sat by the lobby window waiting for deliveries she never seemed excited to receive. Once, I found her crying silently beside the mailboxes, and when she saw me, she wiped her face so quickly that I pretended not to notice. That was the kind of man I had become after my own life broke apart, polite enough to offer help with a leaky sink, but afraid of stepping into anyone's pain. 3 years earlier, my younger sister, Nola, had called me one bright afternoon, her voice shaking, asking if she could stay with me for a while. I was busy, irritated, drowning in work orders and unpaid bills, and I told her I would call her back later. Later became too late. By evening, she had disappeared from her apartment after leaving behind a note that said she was tired of being brave where no one could see. She survived, thank God, but something between us never fully returned. She moved across the country to heal, and I stayed behind with the guilt, learning how silence can become a punishment. That was why, when Maribel opened the door that morning and said she had hoped it would be me, I felt something inside my chest tighten. Her apartment behind her looked like a life interrupted. A mug had been knocked over on the table, sunlight spilling across the wooden floor and catching the dark stain of tea. A suitcase stood open near the couch, half packed with clothes. A framed photograph lay face down beside a torn envelope. The air smelled faintly of lavender, paint, and fear. She tried to smile, but it broke before it formed. Her voice was barely steady as she explained that someone had been calling her all morning, someone she had left behind long before moving into the building. She had not meant to answer, but she did, and now that person was outside somewhere, maybe downstairs, maybe watching the entrance, maybe waiting for her to step out. She said she had planned to leave quietly, just take a bus to her aunt's house 2 towns away, but when she heard footsteps in the hallway, she froze. She thought it might be him. Instead, it was me. I did not ask for details right away. I had learned from Nola that when someone is terrified, questions can feel like another locked door. So I stepped inside only after she nodded, and I kept my voice calm. Morning light filled the apartment, bright and ordinary, almost cruel in how normal everything looked. Outside, children were laughing near the park gates, a delivery truck beeped as it reversed, and somewhere in the building, a radio played an old cheerful song. Inside 4B, Maribel stood barefoot on the rug, shaking as if winter had found her in the middle of spring. She told me pieces of it slowly. The man's name was Varric Hale, though she rarely said it directly. He had once been charming, the kind of person who made everyone else feel foolish for doubting him. Then came the control, the apologies, the promises, the rules hidden inside affection. He never had to shout in public because he had mastered the quiet ways of making her feel small. By the time she left him, she had almost no friends left, no savings he did not know about, and no confidence that her own fear was telling the truth. This apartment, with its cracked kitchen tiles and stubborn radiator, had been her first place that belonged only to her. But safety, she said, had started to feel temporary again. Over the past week, strange messages had arrived from unknown numbers. A note had been slipped under her door, saying he knew where she lived. That morning, he had called from a blocked number and told her he was nearby, that she had embarrassed him by leaving, and that it was time to stop pretending she could build a life without him. Maribel had called a helpline before, she had spoken to her aunt, and she had even started gathering documents, but fear had a way of turning simple steps into mountains. As she spoke, I felt shame rise in me, not because of anything she had done, but because I had passed her door so many times without truly seeing the battle happening behind it. I thought of Nola's call, the one I had delayed. I thought of all the people who say they are fine because they have learned that most of the world does not know what to do with the truth. And standing there in Maribel's sunlit living room, I understood that I had not knocked on that door by accident. I had come to fix a complaint about low water pressure. Instead, I had been given one chance to be the person I failed to be before. I told her she was not leaving alone. I called the building manager, Mrs. Fenwick, a stern 70-year-old woman with silver hair and a heart much softer than her voice, and asked her to keep an eye on the lobby camera without making a scene. Then I called my cousin Idris, who drove a small moving van for a charity that helped families relocate after emergencies. I asked if he was nearby. He was across town, but he did not hesitate. He said he would come in daylight, park by the side entrance, and help however he could. The minutes that followed felt stretched thin. Maribel packed with trembling urgency, choosing documents, medication, 2 framed sketches from her students, a few clothes, and a little ceramic bird that had belonged to her mother. I fixed the suitcase zipper when it jammed. I filled her water bottle. I checked the hallway twice. Every ordinary action felt like part of a quiet rescue. She apologized again and again, as if needing help was a crime. Each time, I told her she had nothing to apologize for, though I said it gently, because I knew words like that take time to enter a wounded heart. Then Mrs. Fenwick called. Her voice was low. A man had entered the lobby wearing a gray jacket and carrying flowers. He was asking which apartment Maribel lived in, smiling like a polite visitor. The flowers made my stomach turn. Some people bring roses like gifts, and some bring them like proof that the world should believe them over the person they hurt. Mrs. Fenwick had told him she could not give tenant information and that he needed to leave. He had not left. He was standing outside the glass doors, looking up at the building. Maribel went pale. For one frightening second, I thought she might collapse. But then something changed in her face. It was small, almost invisible, but I saw it. A decision. She was still afraid, but she was not frozen anymore. She picked up the ceramic bird, wrapped it in a sweater, and placed it carefully in her bag. Then she looked around her apartment, at the basil plant by the door, the painting stacked against the wall, the little life she had fought to create, and her eyes filled again. Leaving did not feel like freedom at first. It felt like grief. We could not take the main stairs because they opened near the lobby. The back stairwell led to the service alley, where Idris could park without being seen from the front. I carried the suitcase, and Maribel carried her bag. The hallway outside was flooded with morning light from the window at the end, and for a moment, it seemed impossible that danger could exist in such brightness. But fear does not wait for night. Sometimes it arrives under a blue sky, holding flowers. We moved slowly down the service stairs. The building smelled of dust, old paint, and sun-warmed metal. On the second-floor landing, Maribel stopped because her breathing had become sharp and uneven. I did not touch her without permission. I simply stood a few steps below and told her to look at the square of sunlight on the wall, to breathe toward it, to take one step when she was ready. She closed her eyes, swallowed hard, and continued. At the back door, Idris was already there, leaning against the van as if he had arrived for an ordinary delivery. He was a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a habit of making serious moments feel survivable. He took the suitcase without asking questions. Maribel climbed into the passenger seat, and just as I slid the door shut, a voice rang from the mouth of the alley. Varric stood there with the flowers in his hand, no longer smiling. He looked at Maribel through the windshield, then at me, and his face changed from charm to anger so quickly that I understood how exhausting it must have been to live around him. He said words I do not want to repeat, words meant to pull her back into guilt, shame, and fear. He claimed she was confused. He claimed she owed him a conversation. He claimed love gave him the right to stand in her way. For a moment, the alley seemed to hold its breath. Maribel's hands gripped the edge of the seat. I could see every instinct in her telling her to shrink. But then she looked at me, and I saw her remember that she was not alone. Idris had already called the police from his phone, quietly, calmly. Mrs. Fenwick had stepped out from the back entrance behind us with two other tenants, both pretending to check the recycling bins while making sure there were witnesses. Varric did not like witnesses. Men like him rarely do. His voice softened, then sharpened, then softened again, changing masks as quickly as clouds passing over the sun. But the van doors were closed, the engine was running, and Maribel did not open them. She did not explain herself. She did not defend her fear. She simply stayed seated, breathing hard, while the rest of us stood between her and the life she had escaped. When the police arrived, the situation became official, but the real victory had happened before that. It happened when Maribel did not step out of the van. It happened when her trembling hand reached for the seatbelt instead of the door handle. It happened when she chose the road ahead, even though it terrified her. The officers spoke with everyone, and because of the messages, the note, and the lobby footage, they took the situation seriously. Mrs. Fenwick handed over the camera recording with the pride of a general delivering evidence. By noon, the sun was high and bright, and Maribel was on her way to her aunt's house with Idris driving and me following in my old pickup. Her aunt lived in a small yellow house near a lake, with flower boxes under every window and wind chimes singing on the porch. When we arrived, a woman named Solène opened the door and pulled Maribel into her arms so tightly that Maribel finally broke. Not the silent kind of crying I had heard behind her apartment door, but the deep, shaking sobs of someone who had been holding herself together for too long. I stood by the truck, unsure whether to leave. I was not family. I was not a hero. I was just a man who had knocked on a door and chosen not to walk away. But Solène waved me inside, made tea, and treated me like I had brought home someone precious from a storm. Maribel sat at the kitchen table with sunlight falling across her face, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked tired but not alone. In the weeks that followed, change came slowly. It always does. People like to imagine healing as a dramatic sunrise, but most of the time it is more like learning to open curtains again. Maribel filed reports, changed numbers, stayed with her aunt, and began working remotely with her students when she could. Some days she sounded stronger when she called. Other days she barely spoke. I never pushed. I just answered. Sometimes that was enough. Something changed in me too. I called Nola. Not just a quick message, not a holiday check-in, but a real call. I told her I was sorry for the day she needed me and I made her wait. I did not make excuses. I did not ask her to forgive me quickly. I just told the truth. There was a long silence on the phone, and then my sister cried, and I cried too, standing in the maintenance room of that old building while sunlight poured through a dusty window. Some wounds do not disappear when we apologize, but sometimes they finally begin to breathe. 3 months later, Maribel returned to the building, not to live there, but to collect the last of her things. It was a clear afternoon, warm and golden, the kind of day when the whole city seemed washed clean. She looked different. Not completely healed, not magically transformed, but present. Her shoulders were no longer curled inward. Her eyes still carried sadness, but they also carried herself. She had cut her hair shorter, and she wore a yellow scarf that made her look like she had brought a piece of sunlight with her. Together, we packed her paintings, her books, and the basil plant that had somehow survived on the hallway windowsill under Mrs. Fenwick's dramatic supervision. Maribel laughed when she saw it, a real laugh this time, small but bright. She told me she had started teaching a weekend art class for women rebuilding their lives. She said the first lesson was always about drawing a door, then deciding what should be behind it. Some drew gardens. Some drew oceans. One drew nothing but light. Before she left, she stood in the doorway of 4B and looked back one last time. I expected tears, and they came, but they were different now. They were not the tears of someone trapped. They were the tears of someone saying goodbye to a battlefield she had survived. She thanked me, but I told her the truth. She was the one who had done the hardest part. She had opened the door. Near the end of that afternoon, as Idris loaded the final box into the van and Mrs. Fenwick pretended not to cry behind her sunglasses, Maribel handed me a small canvas wrapped in brown paper. I opened it later, after everyone had gone. It was a painting of the apartment hallway in morning light, with one door slightly open and a figure standing outside it. At the bottom, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "For the person who knocked, stayed, and reminded me the world still had safe people in it." If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps stories like this reach someone who may need to believe that help can still come, that healing is still possible, and that one kind person can become the doorway back to hope. Special request: comment "I believe in second chances" if you believe no one should have to face their hardest day alone. Years have passed since that morning, but I still think about Maribel whenever I walk down a quiet hallway. I think about how pain can live behind ordinary doors, how people can smile while carrying invisible suitcases, and how the smallest choice can become someone else's turning point. I used to believe life was changed by big heroic moments, by grand speeches and impossible courage. Now I know better. Sometimes life changes because someone hears a broken sound behind a door and decides to knock. Sometimes healing begins in daylight, with trembling hands, a half-packed suitcase, and the words, "I was hoping it would be you." And sometimes, if we are brave enough to stay, we become the answer someone was praying for.